The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting pale beams across the polished wooden floors. On most days, his courtroom dealt with the ordinary rhythms of justice: traffic violations, property disputes, the occasional small-town theft. But today was different. Today, the courthouse buzzed with an energy rarely seen in this quiet American town. The benches were filled to capacity, not just with lawyers and family members, but with townsfolk who had come out of sheer curiosity. Something about the case had gripped the community from the very beginning. Whispers spread from row to row, and a low hum of speculation filled the air. The clerk banged her gavel, calling for order, but anticipation still hung thick like fog. At the very center of it all sat Emily. She was not a hardened witness, not a professional with years of experience in courtrooms. She was a 3-year-old child, small, fragile, and far too young for the world that now demanded her truth. She sat beside her mother, clutching a faded stuffed bunny, its ears bent and frayed from countless nights of comfort. Her legs were so short that they didn't reach the floor, dangling aimlessly above the ground as she swung them back and forth in nervous rhythm. The oversized wooden chair dwarfed her, making her look even smaller than she was. Her mother, pale from weeks of fear and sleepless nights, whispered reassurance into Emily's ear. But it was clear that the mother's own strength was running thin. This was not just any case. This was the case that had shaken their family to its core, and now the responsibility of truth rested, impossibly, on the shoulders of a toddler. Judge Harrison entered the room, his black robe flowing as he climbed to the bench. His stern face softened for a moment as he looked toward the child. He was a man of law, hardened by decades of trials, yet even he could not hide the flicker of unease at what was about to happen. Allowing such a young witness was almost unheard of. Yet the circumstances had forced his hand. The bailiff called the case number. The name of the accused echoed through the chamber, and all eyes shifted toward the defendant seated at the defense table. He was a man in his late 30s, with hollow eyes and a jaw set in defiance. His lawyer leaned close, whispering strategy, but the defendant's attention was elsewhere. He glanced toward Emily, his lips curving into the faintest of smirks, so fleeting most would have missed it. Emily saw it, though, and instinctively pressed closer to her mother, clutching her bunny even tighter. The prosecutor, a woman known for her calm but firm demeanor, rose to address the court. "Your Honor, today we call a most unusual witness. She is young, but her testimony is critical. What she saw and what she remembers may bring clarity to this case." A murmur ran through the gallery. Some scoffed at the thought. Others leaned forward with interest, eager to witness what many thought impossible. A child, barely able to form full sentences, was about to be questioned in one of the most high-profile trials the town had ever seen. The defense attorney wasted no time in objecting. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A 3-year-old? She can't even comprehend the oath of truth, let alone deliver credible testimony. This is nothing more than a stunt designed to prey on the emotions of the jury." Judge Harrison lifted his hand for silence. "Counselor, I share your concerns. But given the unusual circumstances of this case, and the testimony we expect this child to provide, I am permitting her to take the stand. The jury will determine the weight of her words." With that, the gavel came down, and the atmosphere in the room thickened with tension. Emily was called forward. Her steps were tiny, hesitant. The bailiff bent low, speaking softly, guiding her toward the witness stand. She climbed into the chair with some difficulty, her small fingers gripping the armrest for balance. The microphone was adjusted downward until it nearly brushed her lips. From her vantage point, the courtroom stretched like an endless sea of strangers staring at her. She shrank back, tucking the bunny against her chest as though it could shield her from the weight of so many eyes. The prosecutor approached slowly, crouching to meet Emily at eye level. Her voice was gentle, the way one might speak to a frightened bird. "Emily, do you know the difference between telling the truth and telling a lie?" Emily blinked, then gave a small nod. "Yes. And will you tell us the truth today?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Yes." The judge leaned forward, his gaze fixed. The jury shifted in their seats. The defense lawyer scribbled furiously on his notepad, already preparing to dismantle whatever this child said. Outside the courthouse, the world went on as normal cars rolled down Main Street. Children played in schoolyards. But inside this chamber, time seemed suspended. Everyone knew this was no ordinary trial. It was a fragile moment balanced between justice and uncertainty, truth and disbelief. Emily glanced toward her mother, who offered a nod of encouragement, though her eyes brimmed with tears. The prosecutor began with simple questions, designed not to overwhelm the child. "Do you remember the night of the loud noise?" Emily's small hand tightened on her bunny. She nodded again. "Yes. Can you tell us what happened?" Before Emily could answer, a sound interrupted a faint rustle at the back of the room. Everyone turned briefly to see the police dog, a large German shepherd, seated calmly beside its handler. The animal's steady presence was meant to reassure, but to Emily, it seemed to draw her focus like a magnet. Her wide eyes locked on the dog. She stopped swinging her legs. The courtroom fell silent, every ear straining for her next words. And in that charged moment, as the first part of her testimony hung on the edge of silence, the story of this trial, the story that would soon shock everyone, was about to take a turn no one in that courtroom could have predicted. The courtroom was heavy with expectation, but before Emily could utter another word, the prosecutor shifted gears. She knew that before the jury could believe this child, they needed to understand the why. Why had the court allowed such a fragile witness? Why had the prosecution, with all its resources, pinned so much on a 3-year-old girl? The story of the case stretched back 6 long months, to a night that had left the quiet community shaken. It had been late, close to midnight, when the break-in occurred. Emily's mother, Sarah Miller, was alone in their modest home on the outskirts of town. Emily, only 3, had been asleep in her small bedroom, clutching her stuffed bunny as always. Sarah had just finished cleaning the kitchen when she heard the sound a loud crash, glass shattering, followed by heavy footsteps. Her heart froze. The neighborhood wasn't known for crime. Doors were often left unlocked, cars parked with keys in the ignition. Yet, here was the terrifying reality she'd never imagined. Someone had forced their way inside. Sarah tried to rush to her daughter's room, but before she could, a man appeared in the hallway. He wore a dark coat, a black hat pulled low, and his presence exuded menace. He grabbed her arm roughly, demanding money, valuables, anything worth stealing. Sarah struggled, screaming, desperate to protect her child. In the chaos, she was thrown against the wall, hitting her shoulder painfully. Emily had awoken by then. Tiny footsteps padded down the hallway, her sleepy eyes widening at the sight of the intruder. Sarah begged the man to leave her daughter alone, but Emily's memory would forever capture the chilling scene. Her mother trembling, the shadowy figure looming, and a terrifying silence that followed when he finally fled. Sarah survived, but the emotional scars ran deep. She could not shake the image of that stranger in her home. When she described him to police, her account was shaky. Trauma blurred details, and though officers found broken glass and traces of blood on the window, the evidence was thin. Investigators eventually linked the crime to a man named Daniel Cross, a drifter with a string of petty arrests. He was known around town, always on the edge of trouble, but never quite crossing into outright violence. But this time, the case was different. His DNA had been found faintly on the broken glass, though his attorney argued it was contamination. A neighbor had reported seeing someone like him near the Miller's home, but the defense dismissed it as unreliable. Piece by piece, the case seemed weak. For months, the community followed every development. The local newspaper ran front-page updates. Coffee shop conversations circled endlessly around the trial. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Lock the doors, don't go out late, something dangerous is among us. And then there was Emily. From the beginning, detectives suspected she had seen more than anyone realized. In interviews conducted with child psychologists, she had mentioned the man with the black hat. At first, police were hesitant. Toddlers often blur reality with imagination. But the details she repeated: his hat, the smell of smoke on his coat, and most chillingly, the way he had tried to grab the police dog weeks earlier, were too precise to dismiss. That incident with the police dog had happened just a month before the break-in. Officer Martinez, the dog's handler, recalled patrolling when Cross became agitated. Witnesses later said Cross had cursed at the animal, even reaching toward it aggressively before officers pulled him back. That confrontation was written off at the time as a drunken outburst, but now, with Emily's testimony, it painted a darker picture. The prosecutor stood before the jury, weaving this background into her opening arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, pacing with measured steps, "this case is not about circumstantial evidence alone. It is about a pattern. A man who terrorized a dog meant to protect this community. A man who forced his way into a home, leaving behind a mother injured and a child scarred. And it is that child young, innocent, uncoached, who remembers what adults might forget. Children do not invent such things. They tell what they see." And Emily saw the truth. The jury listened intently. Some nodded slightly, others scribbled notes. The defense, however, was quick to counter. When it was his turn, the defense attorney, Richard Lang, rose with a practiced air of confidence. He spoke smoothly, his voice steady, the kind that could lull a listener into agreement if they weren't careful. "We are being asked to accept the testimony of a toddler as the linchpin of this entire case," he said, his gaze sweeping across the jury box. "A child who, by her very age, is vulnerable to suggestion, imagination, and error. We all know children tell stories about monsters under the bed, about shadows in the dark. Are we to believe such tales can decide a man's freedom?" He paused for effect, then gestured toward his client. "Daniel Cross sits here presumed innocent. There is no clear DNA, no direct eyewitness testimony, no conclusive proof. Only the blurred memories of a traumatized woman and the fragile words of a child who cannot even spell her own name. Ask yourselves, is this justice? Or is this desperation?" The courtroom murmured. The contrast was stark. The prosecutor leaned on innocence, while the defense leaned on doubt. The tension between truth and disbelief sharpened like a blade. Emily, unaware of the legal arguments swirling around her, sat quietly on the witness stand, swinging her legs and stroking her bunny's ear. To her, the world was simple. She remembered a man who scared her, a night that hurt her mother, and a dog that had once barked at the same man. She didn't know the weight of her words, but the adults around her did. Outside, the town waited anxiously. Television trucks lined the street, broadcasting updates to viewers across the county. Headlines blared, "Toddler to testify in break-in trial," and community divided over child witness. Inside, Judge Harrison maintained order, though even he knew the stakes. A guilty verdict would mean justice served, closure for Sarah and her daughter, and a measure of safety restored to the town. An acquittal, however, would unleash anger, fear, and perhaps danger anew. And so the trial pressed forward, with Emily at its heart. No one in that courtroom could have predicted how much her tiny voice, trembling with fear yet anchored in honesty, would alter everything. No one imagined that a simple gesture, an innocent pointing finger, and 2 whispered words would carry more weight than all the evidence combined. The case had already divided the town, but what Emily was about to do would shock not just the people in that room, but everyone who later heard the story. The heavy silence in the courtroom was broken only by the soft scrape of chairs as the jury leaned forward. All eyes were fixed on the smallest figure in the room. Emily Miller, 3 years old, perched awkwardly on the witness stand. Her tiny shoes swung nervously above the polished floor, tapping the wood in uneven rhythms. She gripped her stuffed bunny so tightly that its seams stretched under the pressure. The bailiff had adjusted the microphone down toward her face, but even so, her small voice barely carried through the speakers. Her cheeks flushed pink, her lower lip trembled, and every few seconds, her wide eyes darted toward her mother, who sat stiffly near the front row, hands folded tightly in her lap. The prosecutor, Catherine Lewis, approached with deliberate gentleness. She crouched so her eyes were level with Emily's, her tone calm, warm, like a kindergarten teacher rather than a trial lawyer. "Hi, Emily," she said softly. "Do you remember me?" Emily nodded. Catherine smiled encouragingly. "That's right. We talked a few days ago, didn't we? About your favorite toy and your favorite color?" Another nod. The jury relaxed slightly, watching the exchange. Catherine knew she had to build trust slowly, step by step. This was not like cross-examining hardened criminals or hostile witnesses. This was guiding a frightened child through a maze of fear and memory. "Emily, do you remember the night we called the scary night?" Catherine asked carefully. Emily hesitated, then whispered, "Yes." The word was so soft the judge leaned forward to hear it. The courtroom was so silent that even the scratch of the stenographer's pen seemed loud. "Can you tell us what you remember?" Catherine asked, keeping her voice barely above a whisper, matching the child's tone. Emily's little fingers rubbed the ear of her bunny, her gaze fixed on the stuffed toy, as though the answer might be stitched into its fabric. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Tears welled in her eyes. The sight made several jurors shift uncomfortably. A few exchanged sympathetic glances. Others frowned, doubting whether this testimony could hold any value at all. The defense attorney, Richard Lang, sat with arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. To him, this was confirmation of his argument. A toddler was no reliable witness. But just as Catherine was about to gently reframe the question, something changed. Emily's head lifted slightly, her eyes drifting away from the prosecutor. They darted across the courtroom, scanning faces, until they stopped abruptly. Her body stiffened. Her grip on the bunny tightened. Everyone followed her gaze. She wasn't looking at her mother. She wasn't looking at the jury, or the judge, or even the man at the defense table. She was staring at the police dog. The German shepherd sat calmly beside Officer Martinez at the back of the courtroom, a model of discipline. His dark eyes watched the proceedings with quiet alertness. To most, he was just a part of security, an extra presence to maintain order. But to Emily, he was something else entirely. Her hand, so small it barely cleared the railing of the stand, slowly lifted. She pointed directly at the dog. A ripple of confusion ran through the courtroom. Murmurs erupted among the gallery. The judge struck his gavel. "Order," he barked. Catherine blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected this. She turned back to Emily, trying to mask her own confusion with calm reassurance. "Emily," she said gently, "why are you pointing at the dog?" Emily's chest rose and fell quickly, as though the effort of speaking might break her. She hugged the bunny closer, her gaze never leaving the shepherd. I know him," she whispered. The courtroom froze. Catherine tilted her head. "You know him? You mean the dog?" Emily nodded. Her voice cracked, but she continued. He was there. Before. Gasps rippled through the audience. The jurors leaned forward again, pens forgotten in their hands. Even Judge Harrison's usually impassive expression flickered with surprise. The defense attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is vague, irrelevant, and clearly the child is confused. Overruled, Judge Harrison said firmly, his tone carrying unusual gravity. He turned his gaze back to the witness stand. Let the child speak. Emily shifted in her chair, her eyes darting briefly toward the defendant, then quickly away again. Her voice was barely audible. He tried to hurt the dog. The words landed like stones dropped into water, sending shockwaves outward. Catherine, quick to seize the moment, leaned in. Emily, do you remember when that happened? Emily's little brows furrowed in concentration, the way a child strains to recall details that adults might overlook. Before the scary night, she said softly. He grabbed the dog. The dog barked. He got mad. The room was utterly still. Officer Martinez stiffened, his memory flashing to the altercation months earlier, the night Daniel Cross had lunged at his K-9 partner during a routine patrol. At the time, it had been written off as drunken aggression. But now, here was a 3-year-old child, recalling the same event in chilling clarity. The jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. For the first time, something concrete seemed to connect the defendant to Emily's fragile words. But Catherine didn't push further just yet. She knew she had stumbled onto something powerful, but she also knew children could shut down under pressure. Instead, she offered Emily a small smile. Thank you for telling us, sweetheart. You're very brave. Emily buried her face in her buddy, as though retreating from the enormity of the courtroom. Her small shoulders trembled, but her words lingered in the air like smoke. At the defense table, Daniel Cross shifted uncomfortably. His jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. For the first time since the trial began, his mask of indifference cracked. The judge called for a short recess, sensing the tension had grown unbearable. As the jury filed out, whispers erupted in the gallery. Did you hear that? One woman hissed. She remembered the dog. Another whispered back. How could she know unless she saw it? In the hallway, reporters scrambled to draft headlines. Toddler points to police dog during testimony would soon flash across local news websites, drawing even more attention to a case already steeped in drama. Inside the courtroom, though, one thing was clear. The trial had just taken a dramatic turn. What had seemed like a fragile, uncertain testimony was beginning to feel like something far more powerful. And Emily Small, trembling, innocent Emily, had just shifted the scales of justice with a single gesture. The gavel's echo still rang across the chamber, but the murmur of the crowd refused to be silenced. The tension was electric, heavy enough that even the most seasoned courtroom regulars sat forward, eyes locked on the tiny girl whose trembling hand pointed at the police dog. Emily's finger remained extended, her gaze steady on the German shepherd sitting dutifully by Officer Martinez's side. She wasn't confused. She wasn't distracted. She was remembering. And everyone could feel it. The prosecutor, Catherine Lewis, kept her voice gentle, almost fragile, as she leaned closer. Emily, she asked softly, you said you know this dog. Can you tell us why? The little girl's voice cracked when she answered. Because. The bad man tried to hurt him. The words seemed to fall in slow motion, each syllable cutting through the silence like a blade. The courtroom erupted instantly, people whispering, gasping, and shifting in their seats. One juror clapped a hand to her mouth. Another frowned deeply, scribbling furiously in his notepad. Order! Judge Harrison thundered, slamming his gavel down until the noise subsided. His eyes, usually detached and impassive, were narrowed, watching Emily carefully as though he, too, couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. At the defense table, Daniel Cross's smirk had vanished. His lawyer, Richard Lang, jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is leading, speculative, and wholly unreliable. The child is 3 years old. She cannot distinguish fact from imagination." But Judge Harrison shook his head. "Overruled. The witness may continue." The gavel came down again. The weight of the decision settled on everyone. Emily's words would stay on the record. Catherine inhaled slowly, steadying her composure. She crouched again to meet Emily's eyes. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what you mean by bad man? Who is the bad man?" Emily hesitated, hugging her bunny so tightly, its head was nearly crushed against her chest. Her small body trembled under the pressure of the courtroom's eyes. She turned slightly, her gaze flicking across the room, until it landed squarely, unflinchingly on the defendant. Her tiny hand rose again, and this time she pointed at Daniel Cross. 2 words left her lips in a whisper, but they struck like thunder. "Bad man." The gallery gasped so loudly it was almost a shout. The bailiff stepped forward, trying to calm the restless audience. Reporters scribbled madly, some nearly dropping their pens in excitement. This was the moment. The headline. Cross stiffened, his jaw clenched tight. For the first time, his cool facade cracked. His eyes widened, then narrowed in a flash of anger. It was gone in a second, but not before half the jury saw it. One juror shifted uncomfortably. Another leaned back in her seat, her face pale. Richard Lang pounced, his voice booming. "Objection. This is outrageous. A toddler pointing at my client and mumbling nonsense? This is not evidence. This is theatrics. Your Honor, I demand this testimony be stricken immediately." But Catherine cut him off, her tone steady and firm. "Your Honor, this child has identified the defendant without hesitation. She recalls a prior incident involving the police dog, an incident confirmed by Officer Martinez. This is not theatrics. This is truth." The judge raised a hand, silencing both sides. His gavel struck once more. "The objection is overruled. The testimony will stand. The jury will weigh its credibility." The air thickened again, every person aware of the significance. Catherine turned back to Emily, lowering her voice once more. "Emily, can you tell us what the bad man did?" Emily swallowed hard. Her words came haltingly, in fragments that only a child could form, yet each one hit like a hammer. He yelled. He grabbed the dog. The dog barked. Then, I saw him in my house. The same hat. The same man. The prosecutor's eyes widened slightly, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was the link they needed. "You're saying the same man who tried to hurt the dog came into your house that night?" Emily nodded firmly, her innocence shining through the terror etched into her small face. The jury reacted visibly now. A man in the front row of the box shifted his weight, arms crossed tightly, but his jaw clenched in thought. A woman near the back dabbed at her eyes. Another leaned forward, her expression troubled, caught between disbelief and the raw power of a child's certainty. Richard Lang was relentless, refusing to let the moment settle. He sprang from his seat once more. "Your Honor, this child's memory is contaminated. She has been influenced, coached, manipulated." But the judge cut him off sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Lang. You will have your chance to cross-examine. For now, let the witness speak." Emily glanced toward her mother, who nodded through tears. Encouraged, she whispered again. "Bad man hurt Mommy. Bad man scared me." The simplicity of her words hung in the air. No legal jargon, no complicated testimony, just the raw truth of a child who had lived through fear. The jury's eyes remained glued to Emily, They weren't just hearing her. They were feeling her. And that, more than any forensic trace or witness statement, was what made the moment devastating for the defense. Catherine rose, her voice firm now, echoing through the chamber. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this child has no reason to lie. She has no agenda, no motive. She has nothing but her memory and her courage. She turned to Emily with a soft smile. Thank you, Emily. You've been very brave today. Emily's little shoulders sagged with relief, as though the weight of her words had lifted from her chest. She leaned into her bunny, burying her face in its worn fur. The judge ordered a short recess, allowing the child to step down. Her mother rushed forward, scooping her into her arms, holding her tightly as though she would never let go. Meanwhile, the courtroom buzzed like a hive. Jurors whispered to themselves, scribbling notes with newfound intensity. Reporters dashed for the exits, eager to break the news. Toddler identifies suspect in courtroom shock. But the most telling reaction came from Daniel Cross himself. For the first time since his arrest, he looked unsettled. His eyes darted, his jaw clenched, his posture rigid. It was as if the words of a 3-year-old had pierced the armor of his defense. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood. The trial had shifted. A child's innocent pointing finger and 2 whispered words had changed everything. And as the gavel struck to end the recess, the town knew this case would never again be just another trial. It was now the story of a little girl's bravery, a police dog's silent presence, and a truth so pure it silenced even the loudest voices of doubt. The recess was brief, but it felt endless. When the gavel struck again and Judge Harrison called the court back into session, the atmosphere was different. What had been just another day of testimony was now transformed into something historic. Everyone present, jurors, spectators, lawyers, even the bailiff, knew they had witnessed a moment they would never forget. A toddler whispering 2 words that shook the foundations of a defense case built over months. Daniel Cross sat at the defense table, shoulders tense, eyes cold. His lawyer leaned close, whispering furiously, but his face gave him away. The man who once exuded smug confidence now looked cornered, as though the walls of the courtroom itself had begun to close in. The prosecution wasted no time. Catherine Lewis stood, straightening her jacket, her tone crisp but steady. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to continue with testimony linking the defendant's prior behavior to the events of the night in question. Richard Lang rose instantly, his voice booming. Objection. Counsel is attempting to bias the jury by parading half-truths and irrelevant incidents. A frightened child's imagination cannot be considered corroborated evidence. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed. Mr. Lang, sit down. The objection is noted, but overruled. Ms. Lewis, proceed. Catherine nodded and turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard Emily identify the defendant. You also heard her recall an earlier encounter, one that may seem unusual, but is, in fact, a crucial piece of this case. Officer Martinez, please take the stand. The officer rose, his German shepherd remaining calmly by his side. The jurors leaned in, curious now. The sight of the dog was no longer incidental, it was central. Officer, Catherine began, did your K-9 unit, Titan, have a prior encounter with the defendant? Yes, Martinez replied firmly. Approximately 6 weeks before the break-in at Emily's home. Titan and I were patrolling when we observed Mr. Cross behaving suspiciously near a community park. When we approached, Mr. Cross became agitated. He reached toward Titan aggressively. Titan barked in defense, and I had to physically step between them. Mr. Cross fled the area. We filed an incident report that same night. The jury buzzed with interest. Catherine let the moment settle, then asked, and is it true Titan never forgets a face or a scent? That's correct. A trained police dog like Titan can recognize individuals they've interacted with. Even months later, Richard Lang objected again, claiming prejudice, but Judge Harrison waved him down. The jurors' eyes were glued to Martinez, and for the first time, Cross's earlier altercation with the dog was more than rumor, it was documented fact. Catherine turned her gaze back to the jury. Emily, at just 3 years old, remembered something most adults might dismiss. The man in the park, the man in the black hat. She remembered him trying to hurt this dog. She remembered his face when he came into her house. That consistency is not imagination, it's truth. Lang shot up, seizing his chance. Cross-examination, Your Honor. The judge nodded, and Lang stormed toward the officer. His voice dripped with sarcasm. Officer Martinez, you expect us to believe a hardened criminal like my client would attack a trained police dog in broad daylight, and that a 3-year-old child, barely able to form sentences, remembered this phantom event? Martinez remained calm. It wasn't broad daylight. It was late evening. And yes, I filed a report. It exists. Would you like me to read it into the record? Lang froze for half a second, then pivoted. And this so-called report, was any evidence recovered? Fingerprints? DNA? Anything that places my client at the scene besides your observation? Martinez shook his head. No physical evidence. But I know what I saw. And now, apparently, so does Emily. The exchange ended with Lang visibly rattled. He tried to hide it, but the jury noticed. His performance, once smooth and commanding, now seemed desperate. When Emily was brought back briefly after the recess, she sat nervously, clutching her stuffed bunny again. Catherine approached her softly, keeping her tone warm. Emily, you mentioned the bad man wore a hat. Can you tell us what it looked like? Emily's eyes widened as she remembered. She held her tiny hands over her head in a circle. Black, big, like this. The courtroom stilled. Catherine gestured toward the evidence table, where a black baseball cap rested inside a clear plastic bag. It had been recovered near the crime scene weeks earlier, dismissed at the time as circumstantial. Emily, Catherine asked gently, does this look like the hat the bad man wore? The little girl nodded quickly, almost urgently. Yes, that's it. The bad man's hat. The jury stared at the bag, their eyes shifting between the hat and the defendant. It wasn't just a hat anymore. It was a bridge between Emily's memory and physical evidence. Lang leapt up once again, his frustration visible. Objection. This is pure coincidence. Hats are mass-produced, owned by millions. You cannot hang a conviction on the word of a child pointing at a cap. But the damage was done. The jurors weren't looking at Lang. They were looking at Cross, who now sat rigid, his eyes darting nervously. He looked less like a man wrongly accused, and more like a man cornered by the smallest witness imaginable. Catherine stepped forward, her voice ringing with quiet conviction. Emily may be 3 years old, but she remembers. She remembers the man who scared her. She remembers the hat he wore. She remembers him trying to hurt the police dog. And most importantly, she remembers him standing in her house the night her mother was attacked. A child's memory is sometimes dismissed as fragile, but sometimes it is unshakable. Emily clutched her bunny tighter. Bad man, she whispered again, almost too softly to hear. But the jury heard it, and they believed it. The courtroom fell silent once more, but it was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of realization, an entire case pivoting on the innocence of a child's memory, tied together by evidence, testimony, and the weight of undeniable fear. And in that silence, Daniel Cross shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sweat beading at his temple. For the first time, he seemed to understand. The words of a 3-year-old might be enough to bring him down. The black hat sat under the courtroom lights, sealed in its plastic evidence bag, but to everyone watching, it might as well have been a smoking gun. Emily's tiny hands had mimed its shape, her trembling voice had identified it, and the jury could not unhear her words. Bad man. That phrase, whispered by the smallest witness in the county's history, now hung over the room like an unshakable truth. Judge Harrison called for order, pounding his gavel until the whispers in the gallery quieted. Yet even as the chatter subsided, the tension only grew. The jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, some scribbling notes furiously, others staring intently at the defendant, as though seeing him in a new light. Daniel Cross tried to remain calm. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted back and forth, cold yet restless. His lawyer, Richard Lang, leaned close, whispering urgently, but the sharp crease in Cross's jaw suggested he wasn't listening. He was boiling inside. The prosecution pressed forward. Catherine Lewis stood tall, confidence radiating in her voice now. Your Honor, the testimony we've just heard is more than an emotional outburst. It is corroboration. A documented encounter between the defendant and Officer Martinez's K-9, Titan, occurred weeks before the break-in. Emily's memory connects that prior aggression with the night her home was violated. The defendant's presence is no longer speculation. It is consistent identification. Lang shot up like a spring, his frustration finally breaking through his carefully practiced composure. Your Honor, this is absurd. We are hinging a man's freedom on the ramblings of a toddler. Children are impressionable, prone to suggestion, incapable of discerning truth from fantasy. This court must not take her testimony seriously. The judge's eyes hardened. Mr. Lang, you've made your objection clear. It has been overruled. You'll have the chance to cross-examine, but you will show respect to the witness, no matter her age. Lang clenched his jaw and exhaled, visibly restraining himself. He straightened his tie and approached the stand where Emily still sat, her bunny clutched tightly in her arms. His voice was smoother now, laced with false kindness. Hello, Emily. My name is Mr. Lang. Can you tell me, did you talk to anyone before coming here today? Did Mommy or the nice lady, he gestured vaguely toward Catherine, tell you what to say? Emily blinked, confused. Her small voice shook. No, Mommy just said to be brave. Lang nodded as though satisfied, and pressed harder. But Emily, you're very little, aren't you? Sometimes, when you have bad dreams, they feel real, don't they? She tilted her head, thinking. Yes, sometimes, Lang pounced. And maybe, just maybe, what you remember isn't real either. Maybe it was just a bad dream. Do you think that's possible? For a moment, Emily looked uncertain. Her bunny was squeezed so tightly, it seemed like the stuffing might burst. The gallery leaned in, breathless. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. But then Emily looked up, her eyes steady, her childlike certainty returning. She shook her head firmly. No, not a dream. He was real. Badman was real. She pointed again toward Cross, her finger unwavering. That man, the room gasped. Lang froze. His mouth opened as if to reply, but no words came. For the first time, the defense attorney looked like he had no script. Catherine rose swiftly. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Harrison nodded. The witness may step down. Emily slid off the chair and into her mother's waiting arms. The jury watched her closely, every pair of eyes following her tiny frame as she left the stand. Her bravery lingered in the air long after she was gone. The rest of the day's testimony seemed almost muted by comparison. Forensic experts were brought in, confirming traces of fibers found in the Cross residence that matched clothing at the crime scene. A neighbor testified about seeing a man in a black cap near Emily's house the night of the attack. Each piece of evidence, once circumstantial, now felt heavier, anchored by the image of a little girl pointing at the defendant without hesitation. Lang fought back with every tool he had. He grilled the experts, nitpicked reports, challenged timelines. He argued that the fibers could belong to anyone, that the neighbor's sighting was unreliable in the dark. But every argument seemed thinner, more desperate, compared to the raw truth that Emily had delivered. By late afternoon, the courtroom felt weary, but the tension never lifted. The jurors were silent as they left for the evening, their faces unreadable. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their questions echoing across the street. Did you hear the little girl? Do you think Cross will walk free? Is this the most shocking testimony in county history? Inside the defense's private conference room, Lang slammed his briefcase shut, his voice rising in frustration. You should have kept your temper in check around that dog, Daniel. That's what opened the door to all this. Cross snarled, slamming his fist on the table. She's 3. You think a jury will put me away because of a toddler? They can't. They won't. Lang didn't reply immediately. Instead, he rubbed his temples, his silence more damning than words. Finally, he muttered, After today? I'm not so sure. Meanwhile, across town, Catherine sat in her small office, her team gathered around her. Files were spread across the table, highlighted notes marking every inconsistency in Cross's alibi. But their focus kept circling back to one undeniable moment. She didn't hesitate, one junior prosecutor whispered. Not for a second. No, Catherine agreed, her voice soft but resolute. That's what the jury will remember. They'll remember the honesty of a child. You can't fake that. You can't rehearse that. Emily slept soundly that night in her mother's arms, unaware of the storm she had unleashed. To her, it was simple. She had seen a bad man, and she had told the truth. But for the adults tangled in the machinery of justice, her words were anything but simple. They were explosive. They were game-changing. By the next morning, newspapers across the state carried the story. Toddler identifies, defendant in break-in case. Commentators debated on talk shows whether such young testimony could be trusted. But the public sentiment was clear. The innocence of a child carried more weight than the excuses of a grown man. Back in the courthouse, as the trial pressed on, there was no undoing what had been said. The jurors had heard Emily. They had seen her courage. And now, every new piece of evidence was filtered through that lens. For Daniel Cross, the walls were closing in. The bravado was slipping, replaced by restless glances and clenched fists. The bad man was running out of room to hide. And everyone in that courtroom knew it. The trial was heading toward a climax no one could ignore. The courthouse was buzzing with energy when the trial resumed. Word of Emily's testimony had spread far beyond the town. News vans lined the street outside, reporters jostling for space on the courthouse steps. Headlines splashed across newspapers and television screens. Toddler points out suspect in courtroom shock. Inside, the mood was different. The gallery was packed, every seat filled with citizens who wanted to see how the case would end. Families whispered anxiously, and even the bailiffs looked unusually tense. All eyes turned to the front, where the prosecution and defense prepared for their final battle. Closing arguments. Judge Harrison entered, his expression stern, his gavel cracking down once to silence the room. We will now hear closing statements. The jury is reminded that what is said is not evidence, but argument. The prosecution may proceed. Catherine Lewis rose slowly, her hands resting lightly on the lectern. She looked at the jury with calm resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice clear and steady, this case has always been about truth. On the night of the break-in, a family was terrorized, a mother injured, and a child scarred. We have presented evidence fibers from the defendant's clothing, a hat left near the scene, a documented altercation with a police dog. On their own, each piece might seem small, but together they form a chain. And yesterday, that chain was locked in place by the most unexpected link, a 3-year-old child. She paused, letting the words sink in. Some jurors leaned forward. Others kept their eyes fixed on her. Emily, Catherine continued, is too young to spin tailies. She is too innocent to weave lies. What she gave you was not rehearsed or fabricated. It was pure, unfiltered memory. She told you the truth in the only way a child can, simple, direct, and unforgettable. She pointed at the defendant, and she whispered 2 words. Bad man. The room was silent except for the sound of pens scratching notes. She remembered him trying to hurt a police dog weeks before. She remembered his black hat. And most importantly, she remembered him in her home that night. That is not imagination. That is recognition. That is truth. Catherine's voice grew stronger, carrying conviction. The defense wants you to believe Emily dreamed it all. But ask yourselves, can a child describe the very hat found near her home by coincidence? Can she invent an incident with a police dog that was confirmed in official reports? No, she cannot. What she told you is reality, no matter how uncomfortable it is for the defendant sitting in this room. Her eyes shifted briefly to Daniel Cross, who sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, jaw clenched. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine finished, her tone solemn. Justice is not always delivered by the loudest voices or the most seasoned witnesses. Sometimes it comes from the quiet courage of a child who refuses to stay silent. Emily found her voice. Now, it is time for you to use yours. Find the defendant guilty. She sat down, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then Richard Lang rose, adjusting his suit with deliberate calm. He strode to the lectern, his expression one of controlled outrage. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth but sharp. This trial has turned into a circus. My client, Daniel Cross, sits accused not because of evidence, but because of emotion. A frightened little girl, manipulated by memory, points a finger, and suddenly, that is enough to convict a man? He paced slowly, gesturing toward the jury. You have been asked to place a man's future in the hands of a toddler who still believes in fairy tales. Yes, she is sweet. Yes, she is brave. But bravery does not equal truth. Children mix dreams with reality every day. They believe in monsters under their beds. Yesterday, Emily told you about a bad man. But in her world, the bad man could be anyone. It could be a shadow, a nightmare, a story told to her at bedtime. Lang turned sharply toward Catherine's table. The prosecution would have you believe coincidence is proof. A hat owned by millions. A barking dog, nothing unusual. Fibers that could have come from anywhere. This is not evidence. This is desperation. And they have wrapped it in the innocence of a child, hoping you will be too moved to see the flaws. He stopped, placing his hands firmly on the lectern. His tone grew colder. Ladies and gentlemen, do not let sympathy replace justice. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, and they have not met it. Do not let a whisper destroy a man's life. Return a verdict of not guilty. Lang sat down heavily, his face set in stone. The judge gave the jury their instructions, emphasizing the need to weigh evidence carefully, to put aside emotion, and to decide based on facts. Then, at last, he said, the jury will now retire to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly, the jurors disappearing into the deliberation room. Outside, reporters shouted questions, their microphones flashing like weapons. Inside, the gallery buzzed with speculation. The hours that followed were excruciating. The jury deliberated behind closed doors, their discussions a mystery to all. In the hallway, Emily's mother sat clutching her daughter, who played quietly with her stuffed bunny. blissfully unaware of the gravity of the moment. Catherine paced the corridor, trying to mask her nerves. Lang muttered to himself, scribbling notes furiously. By evening, still no verdict. The jurors requested dinner and continued their deliberations late into the night. Speculation ran wild. Some believed Emily's testimony had sealed Cross's fate. Others feared the defense's argument about unreliable memory might sway the jury. At one point, word leaked that the jurors had sent a note to the judge, requesting to review the police report about the K9 incident and to see the black hat again. Both sides knew what that meant. Emily's words were still at the center of their debate. Finally, the next morning, a buzz rippled through the courthouse. The jury had reached a decision. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras ready. Inside, the gallery filled once more, silence falling as everyone waited. The jurors filed in, their faces solemn, unreadable. Emily sat in her mother's lap, too young to understand the suspense, but she clutched her bunny tightly, her wide eyes scanning the room. Daniel Cross sat rigid, his knuckles white against the defense table. Lang leaned in, whispering furiously, but his client didn't move. Catherine sat upright, hands folded neatly, her expression calm but resolute. The bailiff handed the folded paper to the judge. The gavel struck once. "Members of the jury," Judge Harrison said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. And in that moment, between the question and the answer, the entire town, perhaps the entire country, waited to hear whether a toddler's whispered words could decide the fate of a man accused of unthinkable crimes. The silence in the courtroom was crushing, as though the very walls leaned in to hear the words that would shape everything. The jury foreman stood tall, holding the verdict slip in trembling hands. Judge Harrison's eyes fixed on him. "Please state your verdict." The foreman unfolded the paper, his voice steady but quiet. "On the charge of burglary in the first degree, we find the defendant, Daniel Cross, guilty." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Emily's mother covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Emily, sitting on her lap, blinked innocently, not fully grasping the meaning, only sensing the energy around her. The foreman continued, "On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, guilty. On the charge of endangering the welfare of a child, guilty." Every word struck like a bell. Cross's face drained of color. He clenched his fists, shaking his head as if to reject the reality forming around him. Richard Lang placed a hand on his arm, but the defendant yanked it away, fury burning in his eyes. Judge Harrison nodded solemnly. "The jury's verdict has been recorded. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date." The gavel came down with a resounding crack, final and absolute. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Some people cheered, others cried. Reporters bolted for the doors to deliver breaking news. Emily, overwhelmed by the noise, pressed her face into her mother's shoulder. Catherine Lewis, the prosecutor, sat still for a moment, absorbing it all. She had prosecuted many cases, but this one felt different. Justice had not been secured by forensic experts or hardened eyewitnesses, but by the soft, steady voice of a toddler who refused to forget. Across the room, Daniel Cross exploded. He leapt to his feet, shouting, "This is a lie. You let a child decide my life? A child." His voice cracked with rage. Bailiffs rushed forward, restraining him as he thrashed against their grip. "Order in the court." Judge Harrison barked, slamming his gavel. "Remove the defendant." Cross was dragged from the room, his curses echoing down the hall until they faded into silence. The gallery slowly settled, though whispers and gasps still rippled through the crowd. Emily peeked up, her small brow furrowed. "Mommy, is the bad man gone?" she whispered. Her mother hugged her tightly. "Yes, sweetheart. He's gone." For the first time in weeks, relief washed over the family. The courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters, cameras flashing like lightning. Headlines were already rolling across news tickers. Man convicted after toddler's testimony. Catherine stepped out, greeted by microphones thrust in her face. "Ms. Lewis, did you expect the jury to convict based on a child's words?" one reporter demanded. She lifted her chin, her tone calm but firm. "We didn't rely on a child's words alone. We relied on the truth." The jury weighed all the evidence, the fibers, the hat, the canine incident. Emily's courage gave them the clarity to connect it all. Today's verdict shows that truth can come from anyone, no matter how young. "Do you think this case sets a precedent?" Another shouted. Catherine gave a small, almost weary smile. "I think this case sets an example that no voice is too small when it comes to justice." Meanwhile, Emily's mother carried her daughter out quietly through a side exit, shielded from the chaos. For them, it wasn't about headlines. It was about safety, about finally sleeping without fear. Within hours, the story dominated national news. Pundits debated whether allowing a toddler's testimony was risky or groundbreaking. Some called it a miracle of truth. Others worried about the precedent it set. But in the small town itself, the community felt united. People stopped Emily's family in grocery stores to thank them. Neighbors left flowers on their porch. Strangers mailed letters praising Emily's bravery, calling her the little girl who stood against fear. The police canine officer even brought Max, the very dog Emily had recognized, to visit her. When Emily saw him, her eyes lit up. She knelt down, hugging the German shepherd tightly. "Good doggy," she whispered, smiling for the first time in weeks. Her mother wiped away tears as the officer said softly, "She's a hero in her own right." Weeks later, the courtroom filled once again, though the mood was less frenzied. Daniel Cross sat shackled, his once defiant posture broken. His lawyer argued for leniency, citing a difficult childhood and troubled past. But Judge Harrison remained unmoved. "This court cannot ignore the severity of your crimes," he said firmly. "You invaded a family's home. You injured an innocent mother, and you traumatized a child. Your actions were deliberate, violent, and without remorse." He leaned forward, his gaze cutting through the defendant. "You underestimated the power of truth. You thought fear would silence your victims. Instead, even a child stood against you. That speaks louder than any argument I could make today." The sentence was read, decades in prison, ensuring Cross would never threaten another family again. Months later, life slowly returned to normal for Emily and her family. The nightmares faded, though sometimes she still woke in the night, clutching her stuffed bunny. Her mother would remind her gently, "The bad man is gone. You're safe now." Catherine visited once, bringing Emily a small medal given by the local police department. For bravery beyond her years, it read. Emily didn't fully understand, but she loved the way it sparkled in the sunlight. The case went down in legal history. Law schools studied it, journalists retold it, and psychologists debated it. But for the people who lived it, the meaning was simpler. One small voice had changed everything. Emily would grow up never fully, remembering the trial in detail, but she would always carry with her the lesson her courage had taught an entire town, that truth doesn't depend on age, size, or power. Sometimes it rests in the smallest whisper of all. One quiet evening, Emily sat on the porch with her mother, watching the sunset paint the sky. The world had moved on. The chaos of the trial, now a distant echo. Emily turned, her voice soft. "Mommy? Yes, sweetheart? Did I help?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "You helped more than anyone ever could." Emily leaned against her, content. For her, it wasn't about trials or verdicts. It was about knowing she had made the world just a little bit safer, simply by speaking the truth. And so, the story ended where it began, with the quiet power of a child's voice, a courtroom frozen in shock, and two whispered words that changed everything. Bad man.